Okay.
All right. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, let me offer a couple sentences and then I will give my partner in crime a chance to offer some feedback. Okay. Welcome. I know that I can see happily in chat now that I'm somewhat more techno savvy than I was 3 weeks ago, that some of you are here for the first time, many of you are not. Regardless, welcome. We're going to launch our discussion today, this week, about the linking of culture and politics, particularly during really fraught times. And as you'll see, and those of you who've looked ahead and noted what we posted as today's document, I'm going to be focusing on the late 1790s for a lot of really good reasons. And then at the end, making a brief segue back to the present and then opening things up for questions. And at that point, let me give Matt the floor so he can explain the question process.
Yeah, so the question process, if this is your first time or you're relatively new to the process, we ask that you feel free to talk in chat. Try to keep it, family appropriate. This is a family show. But we always like to see where folks are from. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and put where you're from in the chat box. We ask that all questions, pretty please with sugar on top, head to the Q&A button. So if you click on Q&A, go ahead and put that in, and that gives us the questions that we'll be asking Joanne after she talks. Afterward, so after Joanne talks, we'll do some questions and have a lot of fun today. It was a fantastic document, by the way, Joanne, this week, so I will let you take over.
You want to offer the NCHE?
Oh, yes, thank you. See?
I've had my coffee.
Yes. Clearly, I'm only halfway through mine. Yes, so again, this is presented by the National Council for History Education, and if you like what we do, please go to nche.net and click around and look around and join us, become a member, and participate in all the different events we have, from conversations to webinars to we're moving towards some online learning. We're doing some fun stuff here at the organization. So please join us.
Okay.
All right, you're up.
I'm up. Okay, excellent. Okay, so hello, everybody. As I mentioned a moment ago, what we're going to be talking about really is culture and politics. I think I said on Twitter and on the little teaser for today's episode, I'm going to be talking about how politics kind of oozes into everything. You could argue, and I might argue, that to some degree, culture is politicized, generally speaking. Sometimes I think that's more noticeable than others, but one can always, I think, perceive politics in a variety of different things. But what I want to talk about today is the link between culture and politics at times that are particularly fraught. At times, and in American history, when you look over the long haul, there are moments when I think Americans perceive that some kind of major decision or a shift in direction or a decision about something fundamental about the nation is being debated. And those times tend to be very fraught. Those times tend to be hyper polarized. People either want things going one way or they want things not going that way. During those moments, culture becomes highly politicized. Everything becomes highly politicized because people are looking for all kinds of ways to enforce what they feel on both sides is a life and death, fraught, desperate situation, right? And what I want to talk about today is the 1790s. Excuse me. These times, if you put what I just said together, they're fraught, they're polarized, culture is politicized, violence is sometimes a part of that scene. The 1790s, all of those things are true, and particularly the late 1790s. I think that the 1790s generally and the late 1790s specifically get kind of a bum deal when it comes to recognition of being a really fraught moment in time. Generally speaking, the 1790s, obviously, it's the first decade of government under the Constitution. People weren't entirely sure if it would work, how it would work, what it would work like. And on a cultural level, there wasn't a modern republic, really, of the sort that the United States was creating. And I've talked about this in past weeks. I talked about this when talking about William Maclay's diary, right? And how he was looking at everything, every decision somehow had a cultural aspect and then a political aspect. And his diary is all full of him trying to find hidden meanings in things that he's seeing. And there are all kinds of examples of this, everything being politicized because Americans realize the launching of government and what's happening now could shape what's coming. And equally important, people assume that what the political elite did would be copied and emulated by the public, right? So if the political elite acted monarchical and aristocratic, that would move the government in that direction. So obviously that's a period when culture is going to be really politicized. People know something eventful is happening and they're engaged with it, the American public. They understand that something like that is happening. Now in the early 1790s, you can see that these are the sorts of things I talk about in classes because they seem comical, and they kind of are comical, but they also show the degree to which these, supposedly lofty founder types are really thinking about culture and its political impact. George Washington, for example, worrying about what style of dishes should be on the table, presidential table, because if it's too fancy, he'll seem monarchical. If it's not fancy enough, he won't, what is a president? He won't seem dignified enough. Maclay in his diary, in a variety of different ways, says that Washington keeps looking for a middle style, right? Which is a wonderful way of capturing it. He's trying to not be aristocratic or too democratic. He wants to have, some importance as a leader on the world stage, but he doesn't want to seem like a king. So all of these things, his dishes, I think I've talked before about how he tended every day in the afternoon to take a walk around the block. And he did that partly because it proved that he wasn't a monarch. Like, look, he's walking in the street like everyone else. All of these things that seem trivial, and as I said, seem kind of comical, they have importance, and which is why we know about them, right? Because people are writing about them in newspapers, in letters. John Adams was the same. It's a wonderful example of the almost backwardness, the weird logic of this. Adams comes back from Europe where he had to dress in, very fine clothing. There's a lot of lace. He comes back to the United States, and now he's going to be becoming vice president. And he writes a letter in which he says, how much lace is small r Republican? Like, how much lace should I be wearing? How much lace will make me look not American somehow? And he actually says in this letter, he has to wait to buy plainer clothes because he doesn't have the money right now to buy plainer clothes. That's fascinating, right? He's right there. He's like, I can't afford to get plainer stuff, so I guess I'm going to have to be a little fancy right now. That shows you the degree to which people are assuming about the link of culture and politics and the ways in which culture becomes politicized. Now, the late 1790s become particularly politicized and fraught and frantic. Beginning roughly in 1793, you begin to see really the rise of federalists, a federalist point of view and a Republican point of view. And that increases over the course of the 1790s. It's made worse by the fact that foreign affairs, in particular the French Revolution, are having a huge impact on the United States. Some people, often federalists, are worried that the nation is going to be tainted in some way by the French Revolution, and it'll be in an uproar and the people will revolt and the federalists won't be in control anymore, and that's scary. Other people are afraid on the other side that the federalists are some England-loving monarchical party who are just looking for a moment to push things into another sphere. And what seems to us and what today might be a foreign affairs debate is very much a domestic debate. It's those two things are intertwined. Now, the letter that I talked about today is between Adams and Jefferson. Before I get to it, I want to read from another letter from their exchange, and let me offer a little bit of background about their exchange. I realized when I was planning this I was getting all ready to recommend a book to you, and then I thought, Freeman, so much of it's online, but I'm going to recommend a book anyway. So Adams and Jefferson were friends and colleagues. In the 1790s, they were not so friendly. In roughly 1811, a mutual friend brings them back to becoming friends again. And then they engage in this amazing correspondence from 1811 till 1826, till they both die. And they talk about everything, right? They look back and talk about the past. They talk about what they think about government. I think I mentioned once before, I think Adams is like the 5 best funerals of the 1790s. So they talk about everything. They're fascinating letters. The book that they're in is, I think, called the Adams-Jefferson Letters, and the editor's name is Lester Cappon, C-A-P-P-O-N. But the database that I linked to today contains all those letters. The problem is only that you have to construct the chain, right? You have to track the letters from one to the other, which you can do with a little bit of poking around and strategic searching. But at any rate, in one of their early letters in 1811, this is what Adams says about the 1790s, very, very early 19th century. He says, in point of republicanism, and he means small r, the style and ethos and culture of being a republic. In point of republicanism, all the difference I ever knew or could discover between you and me, or between Jefferson and me, consisted first, number one, in the difference between speeches and messages. I was a monarchist because I thought a speech more manly, more respectful to Congress and the nation. Jefferson and Rush preferred messages. I held levees, which are these sort of reception, social events, once a week, that all my time might not be wasted by idle visits. Jefferson's whole 8 years was a levee. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, let me take this back. This is to Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is the guy who links them up. And this is a letter in which, that's why he's referring to Jefferson in the third person. Adams is writing to Rush about Jefferson during the time when they're becoming reconciled. Number 3, I dine a large company once or twice a week. Jefferson dined a dozen every day. Number 4, Jefferson and Rush, who he's writing to, were for liberty and straight hair. I thought curled hair was as Republican as straight. Now, he's being a little humorous, right? He's kind of poking fun, but he also is making a point, which is there are styles of republicanism, and culture showed sort of what political side you were on. You behaved in a certain way and people could look at you and say, oh, you're on that side or you're on that side. And people could use those styles to score political points, to woo the public. Okay, so that's between Adams and Rush in 1811. Adams making the great point about the link between politics and culture. Now let's move to Jefferson and Adams. Like I was saying before, in the late 1790s, things are very fraught. People are afraid of the impact of the French Revolution. The American public is very engaged in what's going on. It's a domestic issue. It's not just foreign. The public is getting divided. You have basically Federalists who are in favor of a somewhat less democratic mode of Republican governance. So they're not as comfortable with what some would call the politics of the street. You know, vote and get out of the way might be what they would say to the public. The Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, believe in a sense, not quite the opposite, but that, you know, protest is good, protest is fine. They're far more comfortable with a far more democratic mode of politics. So what's happening in the late 1790s is there's this chaos with France and fear that it's going to contaminate the United States. There's a recognition that there's some fundamental issue about the fundamental nature of this new republic that's being debated. And all of that feeds into politics. The public gets engaged. There's something fundamental on the line, and Americans understand that. There's also the quasi-war with France, which, as advertised, it never becomes a full-fledged war. But again, add that to the mix that there's a potential war brewing. It's a really unpleasant time. Each side during those years, they're othering the other side, right? So Federalists are saying to the Republicans, well, you're a bunch of French-loving revolutionaries, And Republicans are saying to Federalists, you're a bunch of England-loving monarchists. You're not American. I'm in the true spirit of America. My people are in the true spirit of America. You're not American. And people who are out in the streets protesting and asserting their points of view, they're even wearing on their hats cockades, which are these little like round bits of ribbon. And they were wearing cockades in different colors to represent which side they're on, right? So Federalists in the street put one color of cockade on their hat. Republicans in the street put a different color of cockade on their hat, right? To indicate what side they're on. And I couldn't help but think, and I'm gonna say it even though I perhaps should not, cockades were the masks of 1798, right? You're wearing one, people can tell exactly what side you're on. So now, the Adams letter is talking about that period. He's looking back in time, so as historians, we need to remember that he's not on the spot in interpreting what he's saying. And they've now been brought back together. Some of Jefferson's letters are beginning to be published in other people's memoirs and things, and of course, and these guys are still around and are seeing the implications of that. Adams reads one of Jefferson's letters in somebody's memoirs. And the letter, Jefferson's letter, says something like that when he was elected president, when Jefferson was elected president, a mighty wave of public opinion swept over the nation. And, you know, it's this claim of revolutionary change, which does not please John Adams, right? So John Adams responds first by saying, oh, are you joking? Like, do you really think something new happened when you became president? Let's take the long view here. So he's being friendly and humorous about it, but he's also making a point. So Jefferson responds, and here's his response to Adams's letter saying, you know, not really. Jefferson says, well, whether the character of the times is justly portrayed or not in the letter that Jefferson was just published, whether the character of the times is justly portrayed or not, posterity will decide. But on one feature they can never decide: the sensations excited in free yet firm minds by the terrorism of the day. None can conceive who did not witness them, and they were felt by one party only. This letter exhibits their side of the medal. Okay, think about that for a minute. Jefferson says, you know, the terrorism of the day, that was a thing, and that's what my letters show, and only Jeffersonian Republicans felt it. This is not going to please Adams. It doesn't please Adams, and he seizes on the phrase, the terrorism of the day. So he first says, upon this subject, I despair of making myself understood by posterity, by the present age, and even by you. It would require as many lives as those of a cat. Then he moves on, and he starts listing things that fall in his mind under the category of terrorism. And he talks about a number of things, and then he says in the middle of this list, I have no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophical tranquility when 10,000 people, and perhaps many more, were parading the streets of Philadelphia. When even Governor Mifflin himself thought it his duty to order a patrol of horse and foot to preserve the peace. When Market Street was as full as men could stand by one another, and even before my door, with some of my domestics, in frenzy, determined to sacrifice their lives in my defense, when all were ready to make a desperate sally among the multitude, and others were with difficulty and danger dragged back by the others. When I myself judged it prudent and necessary to order chests of arms from the War Office to be brought through by lanes and back doors, determined to defend my house at the expense of my life and the lives of the few, very few domestics and friends within it. What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? Now, that's as I suggested in the teaser to today's session, the use of the word terrorism in these letters I find fascinating. It's not something that I really noticed before, but for today, in my preparation for today, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to see when the word terrorism started being used. The late 1790s. in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it largely has to do with France and not the United States, but the word terrorism largely is from actually the mid to late 1790s. So the word itself tells you something about the mood of the time, and they're throwing this around here to represent the mood and the ethos and the feeling. And it includes their personal aspects and cultural aspects, and politics is bound up in it. It's the word terrorism in the way that it's being used here really captures something that it means something different in this moment than it means today, clearly. But what it's capturing is the ways in which during these kinds of moments in time, people use fear or intimidation to make their point and to speak over or silence others. That's what he's talking about in the 1790s, and he's putting the word terrorism attached to it. So, it's a period of potentially massive change, polarization, culture yoked in, emotional, a little violence mixed in. In a sense, this week I don't need to draw big lines to today, right? And I'm not going to do that. I want to make two larger points about what I've just talked about in the link between culture and politics. My first point is be aware of the ways in which things are being politicized. Don't just fall into step. Think about what's happening. Be aware when you see patterns. I mean, even just thinking about the mask situation, right? Rather than just sort of taking a side, think about what's happening, realize what's happening, notice that there's another conversation happening that's above and beyond as far as within the political conversation. Be aware. I mean, I guess week to week, I talk about, in one way or another, having us all be smart consumers of politics. This is such a fraught time, and we need to be aware, and we need to be thoughtful, and we need to not just fall into line and not just take things for granted. We need to be alert and watch and act when we feel it's important to act. That leads to my second and last point. So in the late 1790s, the period I was just talking about, and the cockades and the terrorism of the day, one of the things that tamped down that mood was the election of 1800. Right? Jefferson's elected, the people have made a choice, the constitutional system kicked into gear, a decision was made. It didn't settle all political differences, but it tamped down some of what was going on. My point is, and Jefferson actually says it after that election when he's president, he essentially says during times of strife, or when we're in trouble, like someone says to him actually, what would you have done if everything had erupted and the nation had exploded and this election hadn't worked? And Jefferson says, among other things, well, you know what? We could have had another convention. We could have fixed up the Constitution, and then we keep going. But in his mind, it's process. It's the constitutional process and the process of changing that process, right? Amending it. That's the backbone of what the United States is. It's process. And again, as a historian, when you take the long view about fraught moments, sometimes, often, an election can decide or calm things down, or at least make people believe that something has been decided, so the mood changes. A Supreme Court decision, no matter how much you might like or hate it, feels like a systematic, a change within the system has happened. And there's validity to that, and there's authority to that, and that has an impact. I make that point because during moments when politics and culture get so bound up with each other, the process, thinking about the process and how it's working is key. Now, I obviously do not need to say that this fall's election is highly important, but in a way, I'm saying that in a different way. What I'm saying is not as far as partisanship is concerned, but also as far as the mood and the trouble and the potential violence that the system, if there's any way for us to, I don't know what verb to use, get through, coast through, come out of. I don't know. You fill in the verb. But basically, the system, elections, are going to be an important part of that process. Elections that work means the system is still working. Obvious point, but again, during this kind of moment, that becomes a really important way of navigating the bonds between culture and politics. Okay, with that dramatic note, oh, what I do this every week. I'm ready to go on, and then I forget the mug. Okay, the mug. So the link of culture and politics. It's the link between culture and politics, Hamilton the musical, and on the back of the mug it says, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, right? It's about the fraught connection of politics and culture. This took me a while. I was actually last night thinking, uh-oh.
I'm almost out of mugs.
I know, what the heck mug am I gonna use this week? And then bing. So anyway, that is the solution of the mug issue this week. And now I will shut up and I will allow you guys to ask questions.
All right, folks, we only have 2 questions in here so far. So please put in some questions or you're gonna be stuck listening to me. Because we're both academics and it's not like we're going to stop talking just because. No.
We're sure academics. We're academics with some life.
Well, let's start with John Charles. Can you explain the term federalism and what it has meant over the years?
Okay, that's a good question because there are 2 ways of using it. So one way is more focused on the ism, right? So federalism, in a sense, it's the idea that's discussed at the Constitutional Convention and that really is the basis of our government. It's the idea of divided sovereignty, right? It's the idea that you can have different levels of government and that the national government has some authority, the states have some authority, that there's, it's a federal system, not a national system. Federal, meaning different levels, and they're supposedly acting in concert, right? Mm. That's a small f federalism, and it's focused on the ism. Capital F federalism is really more about federalists, which are, a political alliance of the late 1790s and early 19th century, essentially a party, though not quite. The Federalist, or federalism in that way, that has to do with a particular view of government in the nation. Centralized power, more powerful executive, states have less power, industry needs to be embraced. England feels like the country that we should be linking ourselves with. I'm sure that a lot of you have seen or done what I remember from being a kid in middle school, and that is you can go onto a blackboard or whatever the equivalent is today and list Federalism, Republican, and factors one side and the other side. Obviously, things were not that clearly divided necessarily at the time, but there were definitely 2, at least, visions of what the nation could be. And capital F, Federalists and federalism, represented one of them.
Excellent. And just for the record, John's question had the capital F.
Okay, it's a really good question because probably almost every course on politics, undergraduate course on the politics of the 1790s that I teach, at one point or another it comes up because it's logical to want to track the word federalist from the Constitutional Convention on. So people assume, oh, well, if you're a Federalist, in 1787, then you're a Federalist in 1793, but those are very different things.
Mm-hmm. Lisa asks, does terrorism, quote unquote, relate to the French Revolution terror, or do you know?
Well, I did not do what I might have liked to have done, which is really like go back in time. I do think it's the terror, the French Revolution, that's probably the heart of what's happening in the late 1790s. It just makes sense. Yeah. There was a link in the definition to terrorism to terrorist. If I'd had more time, I would have followed the link. And I will say, for those of you interested in this kind of different way of getting into history. It's a tool that I use quite often. If there's a word that seems striking to me, like terrorism, going to the Oxford English Dictionary and looking to see when was it being first used, roughly? What was its meaning at the time? Sometimes those very simple questions reveal a lot about the moment that that word is being used in and what it means to the person who's writing it. So dictionaries, on Twitter, I'm always celebrating dictionaries because dictionaries are wonderful cultural resources, right? And particularly at a time of politics, definitions. We like definitions. But they're also really good historical tools.
Well, that's, yeah, it's a fantastic point, because I mean, the way that we use words is so important in the cultural context in which they're occurring. I mean, it can dramatically change the way that historical documents are being used and interpreted. So, excellent. Tom, it's a very good question, but it is highly polemic, and so I'm going to go ahead and.
I see that question. Let me just make the point I've made before, which is we honestly don't know what comes next.
Right.
We really don't. And it's easy to guess. It's actually logical to guess at what can and can't happen. But I honestly think one of the most important things to bear in mind right now is that we really don't know. And that we, again, as I keep saying again and again, one note, right? And that's why we need to be alert and aware and willing to work for what we think is right.
Mm.
Okay.
What Jennifer asks, when you refer to the process, quote unquote, could you also mean the political infrastructure, like the voting process? Mm-hmm. If the infrastructure withstands the tension, then it brings confidence to the citizen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the political process, the constitutional process, the process of voting. I mean, I really mean the institutional political infrastructure, right? The workings of the system. And, you know, the Constitution, in a sense, is a system of government that Americans essentially have agreed is our mode of governance, right? We sign on to it as Americans. It has been serving in that purpose with amendments for a long amount of time. So yeah, the working of that document, and if the workings don't work, there's an amendment process, right? The founding folk did not assume that whatever they did in 1787 was going to last forever. So they said, oh, we'll need changes here. Amend it. So, you know, the process in one way or another, that's in many ways, I think, the most significant thing that the founders thought they were passing along. Someone's going to hit me over the head for that, but I think that's true. They were creating very deliberately a process and putting it in motion that would continue on whatever was going on in the United States, that would be an engine. I guess they called it a machine, actually, that would be in motion. And you know, we can talk about lots of isms, you know, or, you know, democracy, freedom, and all of those things meant something to them. But I think, you know, the reason, and I think I said this on another week, the reason people like Madison took these amazing notes on the process of creating the Constitution, not just to put in his papers, but because he thought that that process, the process of creating the process, was important for people to know. So process is really important. This is what I find myself thinking about a lot. And I think they understood that basic point as well.
Carolyn asks, what did Adams...
Sorry. It's one of my alumni. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Again, okay.
Carolyn asks, what did Adams mean with the term Novaglian as opposed to, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, as opposed to Virginia?
Oh gosh.
Do you remember?
All I have in front of me is the little chunks of the letter I pasted. So right now I can't tell you that.
Okay.
I could potentially look it up in the after party.
I'm going to jump around a little because we're getting some questions in and I don't want to. There's actually a couple questions about clothes here. So Melissa and Francesca, excuse me, asked questions about using clothes as symbols. Would you say that using clothes as symbols has always been part of American history? That's Francesca. And then Melissa asks, are there other fashions that get politicized in America back then? Shoes, covering up, etc.
Well, I think clothes very often are making a statement, and I don't think that's just American. You know, I mean, if you look at France in the roughly the Revolutionary period, they very much were concerned with how people dressed. How you dressed was a statement of your politics. That idea actually is part of what led me to think that way about the United States. There were books that I found in the library on the shelf where all the other books that I was interested in were, and this particular one really focused on clothing and fashion. And I hadn't thought about the fact before that point. It is probably my very early in grad school. I hadn't thought about the fact that, of course, political regimes and people with political ideas and ideals that they want to communicate are going to potentially care about what people are wearing, or people themselves will want to make a point. And obviously there are all kinds of points that can be made, and some are personal and some are political and some are cultural, and some have something to do with your identity in one way or another. You know, we can go on and on and on. But I think that's true to some degree throughout time. You know, think about it. Like when I've talked about this on the podcast that I co-host, Backstory, and specifically for women, I've talked about the fact that there's nothing neutral that you can put on as a woman, clothing-wise, right? There is no neutral outfit. If you wear pants, it means something. If you wear a skirt, it means something. Flat shoes with no heels, shoes with heels, hair up, hair down. It all means something. And sometimes you intend to make a statement. Sometimes you're just getting dressed, you know, and you just want to wear what you want to wear. But when you're getting dressed, you're having a meaning. I think women have to think about that meaning. I think people of color have to think about that meaning. But you're always making a statement. The question is, when does politics and culture get mingled in with that?
Yeah, Michelle Obama talked about that very topic in Becoming, right? Like the politicization of her wardrobe, right? And that it seems
well, and that's going to be very likely for first ladies.
Yeah, and it's something that has been part of the American tradition for a very long time, is what I hear you saying.
Oh yeah, and it makes sense, right? Because first of all, because forever, right? I can't name a beginning of this, but it's true forever that if you want to judge a culture, you look at women and what they're wearing, right? In the 1790s, there are people who judge the success of a party by seeing how fancy and glorious the women look, right? If they look very fancy and glorious, like, oh, well, that was a successful party, you know, or if they don't look good, it's like, something's wrong. There's, you know, women are sort of cultural statements in and of themselves, whether they want to be or not. And in the presidency, you know, given that all our presidents have been male, their clothing doesn't have the same meaning. Women's clothing does, and the first lady, unfortunately, gets judged in a different kind of a way.
That's wonderful. Timothy Johnson asks, related to as long as we're talking about clothes, related to the question on clothes, were there certain colors associated with various movements or parties? So were there like sort of the colors, the banner that people would wear as banners of their affiliations?
Well, I strategically didn't include the colors. There were the cockades were different colors. I think the Federalist cockades were black, and I think the Republican cockades were kind of French Revolutionary, sort of red, white, and blue in some way. I've seen in the James Monroe Museum in Virginia, his cockade is sitting in a case. I think it's the first time I saw one for real. It's like, that's a cockade, red, white, and blue. So yeah, there were different colors, and I think I've got that right. I didn't say it initially because I wasn't sure, but I think I've got that right. So yeah.
That's fascinating, right? Like you could just walk up to somebody and you kind of already know what their affiliation is just by the colors they're wearing. It's just, I don't know if you can answer this, but it's an interesting question. So I'm gonna raise it. This is Irene's question. One thing I've read a bit about this period is the distinction between aristocratic and Republican theater. Were the political figures patrons of the theaters, one, at all, or two, that match their ideology? Did they discuss plays that make them parts of the cultural conversation?
Well, certainly literature and drama, plays, and poetry, you know, like any other form of culture, could be politicized. I don't think every piece of drama was, but I think people were very aware of the fact that they could be, and some things were more politicized than others. You know, like Mercy Otis Warren, who is a writer. She writes a history of the Revolution, and she writes plays. And her plays have a political meaning to them. I think, and she's very deliberately putting that there, and she favors the Republicans. And there are, you know, novels as well written in this period that are very clearly, from a Republican point of view. The same is true on the other side. Right now, I'm not able to call to mind like a specific play that had that kind of meaning, but certainly march through time, you know, in the 19th century, there were plays that took on powerful political meaning, or actors who were linked with one side or another, and there are theater riots because of this, like in the 19th century. So yeah, it's an excellent question. It's a great example of the ways in which culture gets politicized, and we all get that message.
So Gus's question, if you're looking at it, you mentioned Jefferson's ideology leaned more towards direct democracy. Can you talk a bit about how that ideology coexisted with his embrace of slavery? How were slave-holding slaves supporting politicians reconciling their views over how to govern with their views on slavery?
Boy, that's a big question.
But really easy question, not a lot, no layers there. No.
I'm gonna answer it on one level. That's an important question, and I can't do it justice here. But
we could probably do a whole show just on that one question.
Good, and I've been trying to figure out a way to do that, and I will. But the inappropriately short answer is our nation has always had ideals and realities, and they often don't match. You had a generation of people talking about liberty and freedom and thinking that they owned people. Not only that, but using the language, using the word slavery to protest their relationship. They were slaves to England. So even using that idea and that word, I think that you have to understand American history, you can't look at one or the other. You can't say we've only been a bunch of lofty ideals. You can't say that it's only been the fact that we haven't met those ideals. I think it's the two of them together that mean something. I think the fact, however we were aiming, the aiming matters, as does the fact that we didn't make the cut. And you know, the founding, that's blatantly true, because they're designing a system that is building into itself this injustice, right? And yet they're using all of that language. It's you know, people were commenting at the time, like, really? And these slaveholders are the loudest people, you know, yelping for freedom, Samuel Johnson. It's the fact that they're there at the same time that really tells you something about the United States. And it's the ways in which they're there at the same time and how that changes over time that is really important to think about. Change over time in the United States, and the meaning and process of change. I think both of those things are there at the same time. I think that can be ugly. It doesn't mean that these things are happily floating around being great, and somewhere down here is ugly realities. I think they're bound together. You know, the ugly realities are supporting the people who are standing back and making those claims. And the process of, one of the things about the process of history is figuring out how the people at that time thought themselves into that kind of moment, or thought themselves out of it. How did they do that? Or can we tell how they process it? Is it simply a matter of the fact that they didn't think about that ugly reality side? Maybe they honestly were, I mean, I don't know. I could go on and on and on here, and I'll say something that tonight I'll be like, why did I say that? But the major point is, Jefferson is a very good example of someone who has, you know, the rhetoric and the sort of poetry of democracy, and who believes that he owns all of these people. And he's the symbol of this, and in a sense now a symbol of this at the same time. And He can't be one without the other. And that's the American story.
Right. Wow. Well, I think that's a pretty decent answer on short notice. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And then, so Rabbi Beth Schwartz, a longtime follower and friend of the show. I see your name every week. So your question is, Washington did not want to be a king, but he was a Federalist. Was he just a big picture executive, or did he understand the tension of his position?
Excellent question. I think there were some Federalists who wanted to push the government as close to being a monarchy as they could. Hamilton says that at one point, right? We can't be a monarchy, but I'm going to push things as far in that direction as I can while the government remains small r Republican. And there might have been people lurking around who were like, yeah, monarchy would be good. I don't think that was the case for most Federalists. I just think they wanted politically and culturally to move in that direction. So first of all, Washington himself, since he kind of represented the experiment, there's no way he would want to take that job and then be like, okay, I'm a king. I mean, that would have sunk the entire thing at the outset. It would have pushed things in a direction that might not be recoverable from. So I don't think he wanted to be a king. I think he was very carefully trying to prove to people that he didn't want to be a king. People thought about him that way, like they were pleased that he didn't have children because it meant there wouldn't be a succession, right? He'll go and then he'll go, and that's kind of the end. It was an ongoing thought. So I don't think it's that the Federalists wanted to create a monarchy. I think monarchical is a better way of putting it. And Washington, he was definitely a Federalist. And after he retires, and you read some of his letters, private letters after he retires, you realize the degree to which he was really Federalist, and he was monitoring that as president, trying to be neutral. Mm-hmm. And after his presidency, he is not neutral. But I don't think he or many Federalists would say they want a king. And he was pretty responsible about power, about political power throughout his career, which is part of why he was the first president, right? People trusted him with power because he was the sort of person who would moderate the amount of power he had.
Right. This is my question. Excuse me. So he and Hamilton were very close, obviously, and Hamilton was probably more of a monarchist than Washington was. Did they have conflicts over that issue? Do you? Well, or did Washington be like, hey, wait a minute, this is, did he have to moderate Hamilton at all?
Well, so there's a couple parts to that answer. Part of the answer is Washington very much took the opinions of his cabinet, his entire cabinet, right? He did the same thing with his cabinet that he did as a general during the Revolution, which is he has a group of people, they have different ideas, they don't agree with each other, he hears what they have to say, and then he goes off and makes a decision. So, like we saw last week when Jefferson is writing about a cabinet meeting and he says, Hamilton spoke for 3/4 of an hour. It's like, Hamilton made his point known, and Jefferson did too, and others did, and then, he went away and made a decision. I think that often Washington's take on Hamilton, like with Hamilton's financial plan, which Jefferson hated for all that it was doing, about to do or seemed to be doing to push the country towards being what he didn't want it to be, Washington's stance on that tended to be, I don't know yet, let's see. Or the public isn't sure, let's see. So I wouldn't say he blatantly favored Hamilton, but I do think that basically he agreed with Hamilton, and that goes all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, when they're, and just before, when they're exchanging letters about what they think needs to happen. But I don't, some people said that, I think this is the quote, Washington was Hamilton's dishcloth, meaning anything Hamilton did, he used Washington to like clean up the mess. I don't think it was that easy. But it is true that their relationship is pretty important, and how it acts during Washington's presidency really mattered.
Wow. Fantastic.
Okay.
We could talk about that for a long time, but let's end for the day. And thank you for your time, and thanks everybody. And
yeah, I want to thank you guys all for coming and for asking good questions. I'm still stupidly excited at the fact that I can see what you're saying. I'm so low tech. At any rate, really, thank you for coming. I hope you'll come next week. I have posted what we're talking about next week and have entirely forgotten what it is. I think it's about women.
Women.
And it's a woman who I find really interesting. I think is one of the people I want to talk about and who's really not known. So at any rate, I hope to see you next week. Women and resistance is part of what I'm going to be talking about.
Yep.
And thank you for being interested in history. As I said before, I hope that this is useful to you. It is good for me because it makes me feel that I'm doing something constructive for the nation by informing people rather than just sitting in my apartment eating chocolate and drinking coffee. So anyway, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.